morning everyone. Welcome back to the NPTEL online certification course, Tribal Studies in India, Interdisciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. Today we will be doing our lecture number 53, which is a continuation of what we have studied in the lecture number 52, that is social movements, tribal activism and tribal rights. Now in the last lecture we tried to understand the social movements, particularly in the context of the colonial period. And we also we learned that it's very difficult to categorize the different kinds of movements that happen during the colonial period, and there can be a lot of overlapping in the way in which we categorize and classify movements, in the sense that sometimes scholars classify movements as agrarian movements, ethnic movements, political movements, religious movements, cultural movements, so on and so forth. So while the broader category such as ethnic, autonomy movements, agrarian movements can have different connotations, but if you look at the kind of demands that all these movements have, in some sense there seems to be some kind of convergence, in the sense that these movements may all essentially demand some kind of rights and recognition, or these movements can be against different kinds of marginalization that the communities experience. But at the same time, in the context of social movements during the colonial period, what we have essentially seen is that these movements which were led by many tribal communities in India were largely in response to the kind of exploitative condition during the colonial period. So which means that the entry of the colonial state and the annexation of tribal areas into within the colonial state systems have resulted into massive exploitation of the tribal communities, and this exploitation resulted into dispossession, this exploitation resulted into deprivation, and it also caused enormous hardships to the communities, which resulted into a strong resentments that grew among the many tribal communities. And this experience of exploitation came quite early on, particularly in the context of tribal communities in central India, because of their geographical location, also because they were exposed to the colonial state from the 17th century onwards itself. Now you will see that much of the movements, whether they are agrarian movements, whether they are religious movements or socio-cultural movements, happen mostly in the central in central Indian states. And in the context of northeastern part of India also, you will see that there were a lot of movements that were waged against the colonial state. And likewise it have a very strong resonance with what happened in the central Indian state, in the sense that there was resentment or resistance against the expansion of the colonial state into their areas and into their regions. However, the colonial state being more superior in terms of their military might, in terms of their armed forces, they were able to annex the tribal areas. However, there was a lot of resistance, and it was this resistance that resulted into the laying down of different kind of provisions for the tribal communities during the colonial period itself. Now in the post-independence period also, tribal communities continue to lead different kinds of movements, and these movements again come in different forms. Some movements are very much socio-cultural oriented, some movements are very much economic oriented, some are very political oriented, some are very religion oriented. So in that sense it becomes very difficult to make a very neat classifications of all these movements. But however, broadly we will try to understand with examples some of the prominent movements that happen in the post-independent India, taking examples from the northeastern part of India and taking examples from the mainland part of India. So to start with, after the departure of the British, or that is after the attainment of independence, national leaders in India they faced this very huge challenge of trying to unite a country which is very diverse in terms of communities, in terms of regions, and also because of the kind of governance structures that were already in place. For instance, we have 562 princely states at the time of independence. So the challenge for the Indian nationalist leaders was how to bring all these communities, all these people together under one nation state. So the Constitution of India was carefully drafted, and it was drafted in such a manner that it promote equality and justice for everyone, including tribal and marginalized groups. And specifically for communities like the tribes, the Constitution have incorporated affirmative action to reservation in politics, education and government jobs, so that the communities also come at par with the larger communities or with the larger society. There were also special protections or provisions for tribal communities, particularly with the inclusion of the 5th and 6th schedules. Now, in our previous lectures we have discussed extensively what these 2 schedules are. To just quickly give a recap of this, the 5th schedule is essentially for the mainland parts of India, and I think it is implemented in 13 states today. And the 6th schedule essentially was designed and crafted for the tribal communities in the northeastern part of India. This does not mean that all tribal communities in the northeast are under 6th schedule. It does not mean that all tribal communities in the mainland part of India are under the 5th schedule, but the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule provides the political architecture of autonomy for tribal communities even till today. So, therefore, these are very, very significant schedules which are introduced or included in the Constitution of India. Despite the enormous provisions, enormous rights, special constitutional rights, special constitutional provisions which are included in the Constitution of India, tribal communities continue to face widespread displacement, widespread deprivation due to loss of access to their traditional lands and livelihoods. So, the kind of land alienation that took place during the period of colonialism continued in the post-independent period as well. For example, in states like Assam and Tripura, the tribal population lost significant amounts of land due to the large influx of people from Bengal, first encouraged by the British and later increased during and after the partition of India. Now, during the partition of India, you see that many of the refugees from Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan, have come to India. Now, in Tripura, it resulted into a demographic change where the tribal communities became the minority. Now, in Assam also there was this incentivization of migration by the colonial state, for which many peasants, many communities from East Pakistan were settled in present day Assam, and this resulted into a lot of resentments by the local indigenous communities. So, in response, groups like the Bodos in Assam, who are one of the largest tribal communities in Assam, and the tribals of Tripura launched armed movements during the 1980s and 1990s, primarily expressing their anger over the sudden demographic change and political marginalization. So, a good example to understand the post-colonial the social movements in the post-colonial period is the Bodo movement. Now, like I said, I am taking the example of the Bodos essentially because today they are one of the largest tribal communities in Assam, and the impact of the Bodo movement is very, very strong, is very, very far and wide. So, therefore, it's a very good starting point for us to understand the movement, the Bodo movement, to really unpack the kind of movements that tribal communities launched in the post-independence India, particularly in the northeastern part of India. In 1967, the Plains Tribal Council of Assam demanded a separate union territory called Udayachal for the tribal groups of Assam. So, the Bodo movement started much before this, but then a very organized collective organized form of movement began with the formation of the PTCA, which demanded a separate union territory in the form of Udayachal, which will encompass all the tribal groups of Assam. However, due to the lack of support from the non-Bodo plain tribes and internal divisions, the movement did not achieve any kind of political success. But then from the 1980s onwards, there was a remobilization among the Bodo leaders, then by which they began to demand a separate state for the Bodos within the Indian Union, which marked a fundamental shift from a very pan-tribal movement which encompassed different tribal communities to a Bodo specific movement. So, an important actor of the Bodo movement was the All Bodo Students Union, which was led by the Upendranath Brahma, who became the most important leader advocating for Bodo rights. Now, recently there is in recognition of the contribution of Upendranath Brahma, the government of India have renamed a road in Delhi in recognition of his contribution. So, therefore, Upendranath Brahma is a very, very important figure when one talks about the Bodo movement. So, it is important to understand that during this period in the 80s, by the 80s, Assam was already reorganized significantly. In 1963, the state of Nagaland was carved out. In 1972, Meghalaya emerged as was granted a separate statehood, and the Mizoram, today Mizoram was granted a separate union territory. By 1986, Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram also became a separate state. So Bodo communities as a tribal community feel marginalized, in the hands of the dominant Assamese community, and by which they also began to clamour for a separate statehood. And this demand for separate statehood came strongly, which was led by the All Bodo Students Union under the leadership of Upendranath Brahma. So from 1987 onwards, APSU led a very strong mass agitation demanding a separate state of Bodoland, and some of the known slogans of APSU was divide Assam 50-50, in a sense that they were demanding that Assam be divided 50-50 and a separate state specifically for the Bodos be carved out of Assam. So the movement for a long period of time began, which started as in a non-violent manner, began to be very, very violent. There was a lot of clashes, there was a lot of tensions, there was a lot of violence and bloodshed, and for a long period of time any kind of proper arrangement, proper political dialogue with the government of India also failed, and several militant outfits emerged within the Bodo society, such as Bodo Security Force, which was later renamed as National Democratic Front of Bodoland, and Bodo Liberation Tigers. Now these groups engaged in armed insurgency, including attacks on state institutions and ethnic violence to press for the Bodoland demand, and the movement resulted, although the movement was very, very violent, but on the other hand resulted in some kind of visibility of tribal rights in the context of Assam and also in the larger context of the northeastern part. So finally the movement ended with a constitutional recognition, and autonomy was granted through 6 scheduled provisions. Now today the Bodo community have their own autonomous council, and this autonomous council is very, very powerful autonomous council, in the sense that it is far more powerful in terms of the rights and responsibilities. The provisions that the Bodos have is far more powerful than the existing autonomous councils, such as in the state of Meghalaya or in the state of Mizoram. So that is an example of the Bodo movement, how it started, a very brief overview of the movement in terms of how it started, the political mobilization of the Bodos, and then the current status. So it is a long history, in a sense that from 1987 onwards, and from the 1990s onwards it began to very, very violent. 1992, 1993 there was a dialogue, there was an attempt to bring an end to the violence, and 2000 onwards also there continued to be dialogue, and Bodos were also very persistent with their demands. But today they have settled with the Bodo Territorial Council, and the Bodo Territorial Council is put under the 6th schedule of the Constitution of India, and they have enormous power, they have enormous rights and responsibilities, which are far more powerful than existing autonomous structures in states like I said, Meghalaya and Mizoram. A very important, when one talks about the social movements in the context of tribal communities, a very important element or a very important part which one cannot ignore is the environmental movements. Now in contemporary discourse, many a times we get also this very romanticized notion of tribal communities as guardians of nature, in a sense that because today everyone is talking about sustainable development, everyone is talking about the future of the art in the context of sustainable development. Now many see tribals as the guardian of the nature, whose life or whose way of life are sustainable, whose way of life respect the nature, because they essentially worship nature. So therefore, but at the same time, if you look at many of the movements led by tribal communities, you will see that there is a very, very strong environmental environmental consciousness which are embedded in the movements. So it is important, and many of the environmental movements movements that are primarily concerned about nature, primarily concerned about the larger ecology or environment are led by tribal communities. So in that context one cannot but talk about or emphasize the importance of environmental movements when we are talking about the broader social movements in the context of tribal communities. Now environmental and ecological movements, they are also very, very broad category in itself, because it can encompass so many things. It can encompass movements for land rights, it can encompass movement related to water, related to pollution, related to forest rights, so on and so forth. And the nature of the movements are also very, very different. The ideology of the movements are also very, very different. The agenda that they try to achieve can also be very, very different. So environmental and ecological movements, like any movements, they represent collective action by different social groups advocating for fundamental rights and sustainable living. And most of these environmental movements emphasize the importance of rights that may not be explicitly codified in law, but are vital to the everyday life of marginalized communities, such as control over natural resources, cultural preservation for indigenous population, environmental protection and ecological sustainability. So, like I said, the term is very broad and it encompasses a wide range of local level struggles centered on securing livelihood and ecological stability. Now, one of the most pressing concern of today's world is the environment, right? Because everywhere you will see that there is climate change that is happening. So, environmental movements is not always community specific. Environmental movements is not national specific. It concerns global leaders, it concerns global policy makers, global academicians, how to mitigate this. So, therefore, you will see that environmental movements has become one of the most prominent movements of our times. And so, these movements dates back to the colonial period in the context of tribal communities, and there has been always this attempt, or there has been always this challenge of this mainstream idea of development that emphasize economic growth, that emphasize or equate progress with economic growth. Now, environmental activism in India therefore has consistently critiqued both colonial and post-colonial models of development, in a sense that they have put too much emphasis on achieving higher economic growth, which at times resulted in the compromising of the environment. Post-independent India, the Indian state largely continued or follow a capitalist development model disregarding local or environmental needs. This developmental approach that we follow in India contributed to environmental degradation, deepening poverty and increased marginalization of rural and tribal communities. One of the most pressing issue that one cannot talk about is the issue of development induced displacement. And from the 1950s onwards, tribal communities have been incessantly displaced because of different kind of infrastructural projects. Maybe these infrastructural projects can be in terms of setting up of refinery plants, setting up of steel plants, construction of hydropower plants, construction of roads, declaration of reserve forests, or wildlife sanctuary, so on and so forth. So, whenever the state undertakes large scale development initiatives, most of the time these lands are owned by the tribal communities. Even till today, if you look at it, the most resource rich regions of the country are areas which are inhabited by tribes. Now, any kind of development intervention continue to have adverse consequence on the communities. So, for which tribal communities in India face large scale displacement, and this resulted into the emergence of movements that are closely entangled with environmental movements. So, you will see that many of the infrastructural projects in India are located in areas which are inhabited by tribes, because these areas are also primarily resource rich regions. However, over a period of time we see that movements emerging that protest against displacement, against dispossession that are happening, and also movements that begin to question the environmental sustainability of such projects, by which these tribal movements began to be closely associated with environmental concerns. Major industrial projects, mining and the construction of dams in tribal regions have led to massive evictions, and despite the kind of sacrifice that the communities have made, they are hardly compensated. They are hardly given any fair compensation, they are hardly given any fair rehabilitation as well, and most of the time the communities are left jobless and they are forced to migrate to cities. So, like I said, these development projects, the resentments against development projects, the resentments against the kind of infrastructure projects that are taking place also have largely emanates out of the experience of being treated poorly, and many a times the benefits of these projects did not go back to the communities, for which there is a strong resistance or movements that are emerging. For example, in like Bastar in Chhattisgarh, and we have famous movements like the Narmada Bachao Andolan or in the Narmada Valley and the Niyamgiri Hills in Odisha. So, the Narmada Bachao Andolan is a very known movements that happen in Gujarat primarily, and here one of the primary communities that have resisted this construction of the dam is the tribal communities, and primarily because many of them will be displaced, will face displacement, and this displacement will result into massive dispossession and deprivation of their rights. So, another important example of the recent past is the movements in the Niyamgiri hills in Odisha, where the Kon tribes fought against the attempt for bauxite mining. Now, a scholar Annapurna Pandey argues that this is an example of internal colonialism, where the state is acting more like a partner to big corporations than a protector of its people. Now, why did this community protest these kind of interventions that would essentially benefit the larger nation? So, for them, this, if this bauxite mining took place, then it will destroy the social fabric of the Kon communities, displace many families and force them into urban slums like Saila Sahi in Bhubaneswar. And to this Pandey argues that this created what she calls involuntary nomads. So, basically people who are being forcefully displaced from their homes, people who are being forcefully displaced from their homelands and are forced to move and migrate to urban places like in Bhubaneswar. Now, we are discussing the Niyamgiri hills because it came it received a lot of spotlight and attention when the movement started, and the Kudia, the Kon communities in Odisha are one of the most marginalized communities, and because of this also it received a lot of attention about what was happening in Niyamgiri hills. So, the Kutia Kon and Dongria Kon tribes in Odisha have been at the center of a powerful and inspiring environmental and tribal rights movement. These indigenous communities strongly opposed the bauxite mining project in Niyamgiri hills, which was proposed by Vedanta Resources, a multinational company. Now, why did the why were the Kon tribal communities so much persistent in terms of resisting the bauxite mining in Niyamgiri hills? This was essentially because the Niyamgiri hills for the Dongria Kon are sacred, in a sense that the hills are the home of their deity, that is the Niyam Raja, and they depend on the forest and mountain ecosystem for their livelihood, culture and spiritual practices. Now, basically for the Dongria Kon communities, the Niyamgiri hills is not just another hills. It is where their lives, their belief systems, their livelihood, their entire socio-cultural well-being, the well-being of the community, the future of the community, the past and the present of the community lies in the hills, and any kind of disruption that is taking place in the hills will result into the destruction of the community in itself. So, therefore, because of this sacred, so the hills for them is a sacred place, and the destruction and the destroying of this sacred place is tantamount to destruction and destroying of the way of life of the community itself. So, for which they have resisted against the mining. So, therefore, the mining would not have only caused severe environmental destruction, including deforestation and loss of biodiversity, but also most importantly it will result into the displacement of tribal communities who have lived there for generations. Now, the movement brought together local tribal people, environmental activists and human rights groups both from within India and abroad. In 2013, the Supreme Court of India ruled that the Gram Sabhas, that is the village council of the affected village, should have the final say whether or not the mining should take place, and all the Gram Sabhas unanimously rejected the proposal, effectively stopping the project. So, like I said, and while the movements in Niyamgiri hills thus have a very strong environmental component, but at the same time you will also see that it have a very strong cultural component, in a sense that there was this integration of both ecological concerns and socio-cultural concerns, where the two are coming together in a way that one is that it will result into massive displacement of the communities, which will have severe economic consequences. It will also result in the destruction of the hills, which also means that the hills which is considered to be sacred by the communities will be destroyed, and that will essentially have direct impact in the socio-cultural life of the people. But at the same time, ecologically also it will result into massive destruction, massive deforestation and loss of biodiversity in the Niyamgiri hills. So, as such, in one study the NC Saxena found that over 85 lakhs, that is 8.5 million tribal people were displaced in rural India after 1990 due to big corporate projects. So, the larger picture is that tribal communities, despite of the fact that they are only 8.5% of India's population, they constitute when it comes to the communities or people who are being displaced by different projects, you will see that tribal communities constitute very high number of people who are being displaced. According to the sociologist Virginis Khaka, a major reason for the failure of tribal development is how tribals are treated by the rest of society. While many other communities, dominant communities enjoy full property rights, tribals often don't. Many cannot even access court to fight for their land. They are seen as outsiders and their problems are largely ignored in national planning. So, like I said, this is a point which is raised by the sociologist Professor Virginis Khaka, who notes that although tribal communities make up only 8% of the population, they account for 40% of all people displaced by development projects, yet only about 25% of them ever get proper rehabilitation. Now, in the last 70 to 75 years of independence, we have seen that there are many communities who have faced severe dispossession, severe displacement due to different kind of projects, and you will see that it is the tribal communities who have been disproportionately displaced by these different infrastructural projects, and only 25% of those displaced have faced or received proper rehabilitation. Now, coming to the northeastern part of India today, for a long period of time, the northeastern part of India, particularly states like Nagaland, Mizoram, or even Arunachal Pradesh, did not receive much attention, in the sense that there was no massive infrastructural projects that were being undertaken. But today things have changed, in the sense that we started seeing a lot of private companies coming in, a lot of construction activities that are happening in terms of road construction, in terms of highways, in terms of hydropower projects, and this has resulted into a new kind of movements that are emerging in the region, primarily because many of these forests, many of the rivers are not only the livelihood source of the people, but are also rooted in the belief systems of the communities. Now, if you look at the larger northeastern states today, you will see that environmental movements are strongly emerging as one of the most prominent movements in the region today, and this is essentially because there is a greater push for infrastructural projects in the region. At the same time, we have seen a lot of the construction of hydel power projects. A very good example which have taken in the last few years is the movements in Sikkim, particularly against the construction of dams in river Tista. Now, river Tista is not only a mere river which flows a mere river. For the Sikkim communities, particularly for the Lepchas and the Bhutias, it is a sacred river where their god resides. Now, any kind of disruption in the river will not only be ecologically destructive, but it will also be spiritually destructive, because their entire belief system will be disrupted. Likewise, many river systems in the northeast are integral part of the life of the communities, their oral histories, their myths, their histories are rooted into the resources that surrounds them, whether it is water, whether it is forest, whether it is land. So, in that kind of context environmental movements also have a very, very strong cultural element to it. At the same time, environmental movements also have a very, very strong concern about the question of the future of the people, the community themselves. So, in that context any discussion on tribal communities, particularly in social movements, have to address the question of environmental movements, and these have the mainland part of India have seen a lot of movements, particularly that put a lot of emphasis on the concern of environment. And today in the northeastern part of India, we have seen this coming in a very, very great force today, essentially because of the kind of new infrastructural projects that are coming up in the region. So, with this I end this lecture. Now, in this lecture we have tried to understand some of the movements that happened in the post-colonial period, and we have taken two examples. One example is the Bodo example, the other is the Dongria Kon communities in Odisha. Now, these two movements are qualitatively different in terms of the nature of the movement, why it emerged, how it emerged, but then at the end of the day what they essentially try to achieve is to get recognition, to get their rights respected, in a sense that because of the kind of marginalized conditions that the communities face, particularly in the context of the Bodo communities. Now, when it comes to the Dongria Kon communities, the movement essentially question the kind of development model that is being followed, in a sense that it is not only ecologically destructive, but it is also socially, culturally, economically destructive for the communities. So, you can take, there are a lot of examples one can talk about when we look at environmental movements, particularly in the context of tribal communities. But this movement by the Dongria Kon communities is very, very important, in the sense that came at a time when India was pushing very strongly for to achieve higher economic growth, and there are communities whose life will be entirely shattered by this. In that kind of context, the question of environment always comes up. At what cost do we want development, at what cost we want economic growth and progress. No one is against development per se, but then there are certain other questions that one has to address, and social movements in the form of environmental movements have always reminded us that one has to also try to maintain a balance between the desire for growth and development, and also the need to be quite conscious about the impact of our actions on the environment. So, I am going to stop here. Thank you so much.